Good afternoon or good morning if you're in Singapore, and welcome to this pitch coaching session with Zal Dastor, a mentor at Climate Salad. My name is Charlotte Connell, and before I get started, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the land of which we meet. For me, that's the Gubbi Gubbi people, and I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and joining us on the call, and honour their continuous connection to country, land, and sea. Zal, I'm going to hand over to you, and as I let people come in, and we're also joined by another mentor, Sherman here, Mac, as well, which is fantastic. So please, this is an interactive session. Zal works in and lives and expands businesses in Singapore and has great perspectives to share with us all. But please ask questions, raise your hand, come off mute, and use the chat function. Zal, I'm going to hand over to you now.
Awesome. Hey, everybody. Lovely to be here. Happy to help out as well, and to get involved with Climate Salad and a trip up to Singapore, which is quite an exciting thing. I'll share my screen and then we can sort of kick off. And as Charlotte said, look, please, I kind of designed this with a notion that it would be interactive. So I've got as many of you as I can on my screen over here. And so if you have any questions, comments, if there's something specific about your business or your product that you'd like to ask in kind of relevance to what I'm talking about, please just, put up your hand or shout out or something, and I'm happy to chat. And I think that it kind of makes it a bit more interesting, a bit more fun if there are questions involved. So just as a quick introduction to who I am and why am I speaking about Singapore. I moved here when I was 6 years old, so I grew up in Singapore, went away for uni, where I spent a good chunk of time in Australia, which is where my kind of Australian connection comes from. I was in Melbourne for 5 years doing my undergrad and master's, and worked at ANZ for a little while. And then about 15 years ago, I started my entrepreneurial journey. So I started a company in India, which was selling hotel venue space for weddings, conferences, and events. And then, that was in 2009. The internet was a funny thing in India at that time. That it wasn't really what it is now. Moved back to Singapore in 2011, 2012, and started a company that I would end up running for about 15 years, which was in lead distribution and lead management. So in that, we dealt with companies or clients from Japan to Mexico, up and down Southeast Asia, Europe, and even in Africa. And after that, I kind of wanted to transition into a green business. And so now I've joined as a partner a recruitment company focusing on helping people in sustainability and climate, and ideally helping people from legacy jobs into new ones. But most of my life has been here in Singapore. I've done a lot of business in this part of the world. And so I think that's why Charlotte sort of asked me to help out and see if I can provide any useful information to you guys. So as I said, I wanted this to be an interactive session, and I basically put on here kind of talking points and things to discuss as like a brain dump of what I would tell people that was coming to Singapore. So the first thing, and you will notice that this is a recurring theme in this presentation, is that unlike most governments in the world, the Singapore government is an extremely effective and efficient one. The kind of support that you can get here, the kind of programs that are available to companies. Now, I've listed just some of them here in terms of financial support, but also tax incentives, right? This is really helpful, not only necessarily for you, but also for your clients, right? If your clients can get a tax write-off for conducting an energy audit, or if they can write off the expense of your product by putting it into their facility, you need to know that. You should know that. The other thing is that Singapore is a very government-led economy. Like the Ministry of Finance has a stake in 30% of the companies listed on the Singapore Stock Exchange. They are followers of what the regulation is. So to give you kind of a bit of perspective on that, right now, Singapore has come out and said, I think the 50 or 100 most polluting companies need to start reporting their carbon emissions. It's not something that has gone out to every listed company, but it's just something that is right now for the most polluting, but they expect it to be rolled out. So the biggest and hottest trend now in Singapore in terms of what companies are looking for is reporting software, because for the first time they're being asked to report on this. They don't know how to report it. They don't know how to analyze it. They don't know how to manage that data. So that's something where you can see the regulation has started, and then the demand for that comes in later. So a lot of, especially in the built environment, a lot of the market will follow where the regulation is. Singapore has something called the Singapore Green Plan. And, you know, I must say that I don't know, I looked at the poll, and not a lot of you have done much business in Asia. Unlike most Asian countries where, and I hope I'm not, you know, being disparaging, but, you know, plans can be set and not really achieved. I know that, for example, Indonesia, they just opened their monorail and the approval happened in 1963 or something like that. Singapore is not like that. Singapore tends to kind of overachieve their goals. So there, if you align with the Green Plan and what's going on in there, you will kind of align with where the Singapore government wants to go with the country and where they want to take it. So the other thing that is here and is this incredible ecosystem. Look, and the value of Singapore being this tiny city state really starts to showcase in places like this, because you don't have, you know, in Australia where maybe the VC funds are split between Melbourne and Sydney. And so if you live in one of these cities, then great. But if you don't live in one of these cities, then it might be hard for you to build relationships and connect. Everything is kind of condensed in this very small space. So I would say that on your trip here, to definitely make the most of that, you know, make the most of the fact that you can do, if you have a full day, you can do 4 or 5 meetings in a day, whereas in most countries, getting 2 or 3 with the travel is almost impossible. So depending on what you're looking for, the research and the university facilities here are fantastic and helpful in terms of working with you to be able to, I suppose, prove yourself or develop a reputation, which may be another theme that you'll see here, because Singapore and most of Asia is a low trust economy. So I don't know if you guys are familiar with these phrases, like in Australia, the US, UK, these kind of developed countries are high trust economies. Like if somebody says that they're a plumber, you'll kind of imagine that they know what they're doing. Most of Asia is low trust, which is that you don't know whether this person knows what they're doing. So you need to get like referred, you need to get introduced. It's a lot of relationships. It's understanding that. And that's another theme that you'll see, like in terms of partnerships and developing your network and relationships, that actually becomes a really important thing that you need to do. But take a look at what it is you're looking for. Do you want someone to back your research, value your IP? Do you want someone to help launch you? Do you want someone to help you ideate ideas further, or are you just looking to raise money? Because it's all possible here, and it also depends on how much, you know, for example, time you want to spend here. Whoops. Access to funding. I don't think I need to talk a lot about this. There are dozens of different types of funding in Singapore. I mean, the amount of family office money that's moved in here, which may be a little bit further down the chain for a lot of the companies that are your size, but there's everything from angel investors, VC. The other thing that Singapore has, which, you know, the corporate innovation funds, there are a lot of these funds that are here that people are trying to set up and work with, so that there's chances for that. And there's also a lot of government funding, which I'll talk about later. The other thing that is worth noting with Singapore is that it is the preferred place that if you are going to raise money anywhere in Southeast Asia, it's almost always preferred that you do it in Singapore. So there's some of these names. I don't know if you're familiar with Grab, which is like the Uber for this part of the world. It was originally started in Malaysia, but they brought them down to Singapore. Even Sea Group, which is, I think, the only Southeast Asian company to be listed on the NASDAQ, is that they're originally from China. They come to Singapore because Singapore is seen as a secure place for you to invest. There are secure courts of law. The banks are structured in a particular way that they're not going to disappear overnight. So it provides investors with a huge amount of stability and comfort if the company becomes listed in Singapore, or not listed, but registered and does their funding here. So market opportunities, and I'm talking specifically about Singapore, but as a market, to be fair, Singapore isn't the most amazing, right? You're a 5 million population. I think you guys are in the built environment, which means that a lot of B2B sales, which is great for construction development, which is huge in this part of the world. But as a market itself, with only 5+ million people, it's not huge. But there are certain sectors that are definitely being focused on more than others. Energy, transportation, construction, and waste management in particular. These are companies that, or these are areas where Singapore knows they have critical issues. Another one, maybe not so relevant to you guys, is food. So currently, I think we import about 98% of our food, and the goal is to have 30% of it homegrown at some point, right? So you can see where, if you are aligning with that mission to get 30% more food grown in Singapore, that's where companies will get more involved. There's also something called the Smart City Initiative, which may be worth checking out to see how relevant any of your products or services are to that. And the other thing is that this is a useful test bed before sort of expanding into Southeast Asian markets, for you to be able to get a little bit of an understanding, especially if you haven't done a lot of work in this part of the world. And I think when I talk about the pitching, I'll really talk about the difference between kind of working in Australia and the Australian style of working and the Australian style of doing business versus the kind of more Asian style of doing business, which can be a bit confronting at times, especially if you're very used to doing one. So, and again, collaboration and partnerships, right? This is a bit obvious, but if nobody knows you here, you need to build up credibility. This goes to that point I made earlier about trust. You need, someone needs to trust you. Someone needs to believe that you know what you're doing. And typically that comes by saying, hey, we work with, whether it's research, government, companies, whatever it is, we have some level of credibility in the local market to showcase to you. You need to understand how the network works. You need to understand that you might need to be here to develop those relationships. And I think that is something that is a little bit more unique in this part of the world. It's very relationship building, relationship focused, as opposed to transaction focused, which it can be in other parts of the world. So I'm just going to take through some ideas in terms of what might be different, but I thought this might be a good time to stop. Does anybody have any questions? Anybody like to comment or ask or anything? No, unusually shy group.
Zal, maybe I should comment a little bit, sorry.
Sure.
I think a lot of things that Zal brought up, it's correct about Singapore, but there are things that as you know, if you put a number of mentors in a different place, all of us tend to have disagreement. And that's where I think innovation starts in many ways. I do agree, especially about transaction versus relational. It's very important for all of you going to Singapore to understand that very, very quickly. And also who you actually get as your, let's call it a sponsor or something of that nature, because credibility needs to be built. The other thing I would like to highlight about Singapore, don't think of Singapore as a destination that you're going to go to as one place. It is actually a gateway to the rest of Asia. Use it as a stepping stone. Very, very different from the rest of Asia, to be honest. It's the only country, let's put it this way, in its 56 years of history, that went from a bankrupt nation to a first world within 30 years. No other countries has done that. So remember a few very important points. Singaporeans today are very proud people. If you think about it, they sold Christmas Island in 1958 to actually survive to Australia for $20 million. Today, they are the fourth largest asset holder in Australia. So take those things in mind. The other thing that I think it's very important for you all to do is to break the ice very, very quickly in Singapore when you start to talk to people. Sports is not an important icebreaker, in all honesty, because most Singaporeans don't care about sports unless it's about glamour and so forth. Food is a very important thing. Take that into consideration if you're going to break the ice very quickly with conversations, because that's their national pastime. I think the other thing that Zal brought up, which I think it's important to highlight, is this. Singapore government have a long-term vision. Remember, it is technically a democracy, but it's been one-party government for the whole of its history so far. And they actually have a strong majority in many ways. You will notice a few things. Zal brought up about how important food is, about things like food security. So today, Singapore has 9% food security, which means it grows its own food in that sense. By 2030, they want to get up to 30%, meaning that if you can actually look at cross-pollination of your businesses, be it smart city infrastructure and so forth, towards things like increasing food production or reducing harm to food and so forth, you might actually get a good win that way as well. Be aware that some of the software that Singapore already has now for smart city, it's way ahead of Australia. So do your homework. Understand what they have as a smart city compared to what Australia has, because they are a much smaller place. The other thing that you will need to understand very quickly, it's population GDP per capita. It is one of the highest in the world. It is more than double Australia's GDP right now. The reason behind that is that investment is not just in Singapore. It is a lot of its neighbors that are actually investing in Singapore. Therefore, when you start to meet VCs, you will be meeting VCs not of Singapore background, as an example. It could be from countries like Thailand, Indonesia, India, China, Malaysia, and across many, many different countries. So yeah, so Zal, sorry, take it away. If I just wanted to run a few things via the group very, very quickly. That's all.
No, fantastic. Happy to have any further input. And yeah, absolutely, Sherman's right. I mean, I think you're starting to understand a little bit about how involved the government is here, and that's, again, what I'm talking about here. When you are talking and pitching this, you kind of have to highlight how your product is going to connect and relate to their green plan. And the Singapore government, to put it in perspective, they plan 100 years in advance. So even something like their drains, which they've just approved $900 million of funding for, and to think about like what developed country is devoted $1 billion to drainage. They understand, with sea levels rising, this is going to be something that is crucial infrastructure to the nation. And we know that if we structure that this is going to be spent over the next 15 years to improve our drainage situation, we're going to follow through with that, and we're going to do that. So if you can align with what your product and solution aligns with these goals, and demonstrates how you're going to help the country get there. I think the other thing to, what Sherman said about Singaporeans being proud is really true. It's a very collectivist society. So the understanding that the group matters much more than the individual. So everybody is pulling together for the growth and development of the nation. It sounds cheesy, but in honesty, it's pretty true, right? And that's how they've been raised. It's a very hierarchical society. I mean, any country which has a enforced military, you'll see that there automatically creates like quite hierarchical based societies in companies. So you don't have people that are, and this again comes back to Sherman's point of like, who is your champion in the organization? If your champion is someone senior, that's great, and they're able to then use their influence in the organization to kind of push things and get them happen. But if you're talking to the most junior person in the company, it's going to be very hard for him to run that up the flagpole and use sway to convince people, right? Because it's not necessarily just about who brings the best ideas to the table. The chain of command is something that's very important and not only in Singapore, but you'll kind of notice this all in Asia, the kind of deference. And that's also something that I think I had to learn when I started selling in Asia properly when I moved back here, which is when I was pitching, I used to pitch like I had the greatest product in the world because I had to believe that I had the greatest product in the world when I was doing that pitch. But a lot of the feedback that I got was that in this part of the world, you need to be a little bit more deferential. You need to be a bit more like humble in front of your prospect, in front of your client. You can't come in with this kind of American all guns blazing, rah, rah, rah. It doesn't work in this part of the world. So there needs to be, you need to kind of come in and say, and just be a bit more respectful to whoever it is you're pitching. And that's kind of, it's a power dynamic, but it's important if you want to get their business. Again, what is the local relevance, right? How does this help in terms of the local market, in terms of the regulations? That's another really big thing. I would suggest that you kind of Google around whatever specific regulations are around your product or around your industry and understand where they're going and how what you're doing and the product that you have is connecting to that particular regulation. And I think, look, as Singaporeans in general are kind of used to being very much told what to do. So if you go there and you say, this is the government regulation, this is how we're going to help you achieve this regulation, this is the way that we've proven that we've achieved this in the past, you kind of let out a very methodical way, and it becomes difficult for them to say no. They're very, it has to be kind of very prescribed almost, like in terms of how you are helping them and what you're going to do for them. So then, of course, this is an important part, right? The environmental impact that you are having. What is that? How do you, but again, if you look at the words that I've used here, I talk about data, I talk about quantifying, use specific metrics, case studies. There needs to be a lot of evidence, right? That's something that is, again, very useful in Asia, right? People like to see proof. They like to see evidence of what you've done. And I used to work in an agency here, and I joked that one of the comments I used to get from clients was, we want something new, we want something innovative, and we want 4 case studies to see where this has worked in the past before. And you're like, well, that's a little bit challenging to do something brand new and out of the box, but have proof for how it works before. So, I think that the proof from how it works before is really important here in terms of they want to see where you've worked, and not just like, oh, you've worked for XY client. No, you've worked for XY client in our industry, in our country, in our space, so that we can really understand that you know what to do in this space and you know what can be done here. And then, pilots, obviously, the other thing I would recommend, and I tell this to all the startups that I mentor, whatever you do, never, ever agree to a free pilot, and everybody will push you. And that's something else that, you've got to be prepared for. I mean, I don't know whether I should be saying this, but I would increase all of your prices 25% just so that you can give people like a 15 to 20% discount and everybody feels good about it. Because honestly, that's something that it's just part of doing business here. If you don't give the guy a discount, even if you're coming in at your cheapest price, he doesn't feel like he's got any value. Sherman?
I totally agree with that. If you go to other parts of Asia, it's even funnier. Going off what Zell said, some of it, I would say, your negotiation only starts after you sign your contract. But Singapore isn't like that too much, but still, they love a bargain. They love a so-called a win-win situation where you give them something. The other thing I think of what Zell said, one of the things about the region is very important for you to understand about Singapore is that it is part of ASEAN. Therefore, if you're trying to sell to larger parts rather than just Singapore itself, they have all the free trade agreements. So when you're going to develop something for Singapore market, think about that you can actually get access to the other markets too, because of all these free trade agreements. So I think it's a good stepping stone as a place, but remember, it's very different from the rest of Asia.
The the other thing that I will say about, and just this is some helpful advice, which is you can negotiate all you want in a price with the person that you're doing the business with, the ultimate buyer within the company. But if you're working with a company big enough, eventually you're going to get thrown to procurement. And if you think about how does that guy sitting in the procurement office, how does he get his bonus? He gets his bonus by going to his boss and saying, hey, this was the price and I got this much of a discount for you. So you got to save at least 10% at the end, which is just the procurement discount, so that this guy can go and have face and say, I managed to squeeze another 10% out of them, and I should be rewarded for that. So going in with your absolute rock bottom price, ultimately the only guy that's going to get screwed is you, because if you cannot give that discount, that person will say, well, maybe we shouldn't go with this product.
Yeah, Zell is very true, very correct in saying that. The other thing to get ready for is that after a few years, if they look at your revenues are strong and so forth, get ready for a takeout. They will buy you out sometimes, not all the time. I've done a few whereby we went in with a set price, looked at certain things. Within 3 years, they gave you a check that you cannot say no to, because they think that it's worth for them to buy you out. So I think Zell used a good example about Grab. Uber was actually in Singapore before Grab. To me, and I know this sounds terrible, especially we are being recorded, Grab is basically just a carbon copy of Uber in many ways. What happened next was that they were better funded in Asia, and basically Grab bought out Uber in Asia. So get ready for some of these kind of things. You might either hate it or you might love it, depending on what your exit strategies are. So think about that as well, because there will be people that you meet that will actually be looking at what your exit strategy is pretty early on. Because if they think you have an idea or something that is worth for them to capture, they will start to look at investing in you early.
And I mean, look, Singapore, in terms of built environment and construction and development, like the largest companies here are all in that space, particularly like property. And so if you're providing something that could really, and again, going back to that point, if you really show them how you can lower their costs, right? Like the other thing that I think people don't really understand if you haven't done business in Asia is really how money focused people are here. So if you're speaking in organizations and you're pitching the environmental benefits, if you cannot back that up with literally like dollars and cents and showing significant cost reductions, even if you, so I know someone who I talked to, they deploy solar panels on roofs. And the whole thing with them is that we'll do it for free. We'll do it, we don't charge you anything. We only take like a difference between what the electricity you were consuming before and what you're consuming now. So you get an ultimate saving of, let's say, 20%. So the number of people that come back and say, you know what, it's not a big enough number. Like, I don't really care if it's helping the planet, hurting the planet. And that's another thing that I think, coming from Australia, you may be a little bit surprised about, is really how few people care. It's not what is top of mind. People are not voting in elections about climate change here. It's starting to change, especially with the younger generation, but very much with the older generation, that is not the case, And I think when you come from a country where people do, I remember the recycling protocol in Australia, what that was like 10, 15 years ago. Here, you just throw everything into a bin and they don't even recycle it. They just burn everything, because in Singapore, they have waste to energy. So they have calculated that it is more efficient for them to just burn everything and create energy from that. And that's how they process it. So you are talking about culturally being maybe a little bit behind what you may be used to in terms of engaging people in conversation, particularly senior stakeholders. Like, they all know that they have to do something, but if you can't connect that to cost, if you can't connect that to how their benefit is going to their business is going to benefit, how much more profit they're going to earn from it, it's very hard for them to make a business case. So, well, I mean, I should have saved that spiel for this. Cost effectiveness, right? And scalability. That it's really it's very top of mind here. People, you know, people will walk 2 kilometers to get a chicken rice that's 40 cents cheaper because for them there was value in that. You know, and then they'll come back and compete with each other as to who got the cheapest chicken rice. Like you know, that so money is a really prevalent part of the society. So I think you have to articulate how once it comes in, it can be scaled. And look, scalability, I'm assuming that's something that is in all of your plans and processes. And if it's not, you should really think about it because it's quite an important part of being a business and a startup, especially, right? So what are the savings? What are the financial benefits you can bring? If you look at all of your benefits before you come to Singapore, I want you to put them up on a board and I want you to look at which are the environmental ones and say that these are all the nice to haves, right? But nobody when I pitch is going to care about this. What are the unenvironmental benefits? What are the cost benefits? What is the profit benefit? What are the other ways that you're going to benefit this business? And then whatever happens in the environment will be a nice incidental side case. But it can't be the bulk of the pitch because that's not what people are getting involved in. So again, where I talk about relationships, partnerships, right? Where is the proof that people can trust who you are? Where is the proof that people can trust what you are saying, right? Because it's and this is what I mean about a low trust economy. It's very easy for you to go and start making claims about what your product does, what you do, what you can do, without having proof or without having somebody that says, I verify this person, I back this person. It's just going to take a lot more effort in convincing and talking. And that's, you know, that's part of, I mean, I receive 4 scam calls a day here claiming to be the High Court, the tax office, the Ministry of Home Affairs, right? And this is what I mean. These are people pretending to be the government and they're trying to scam me. So you're kind of, your defense is always on a little bit higher as to where is the proof that this works and this person claims what he can actually do. Sherman, is there anything that you'd like to add?
No, I've got a few more points to add with you, Zell, afterwards, but I think please carry on.
Sure. So this is just going through a little bit about the go-to-market here. So
Zal, can I just ask a quick question before you move on?
Please.
Great, thanks. So yes, just in terms of the kind of proof points, certainly a lot of our proof points will be based on the Australian market, on our relationships here. Just wanted to ask a sort of quick question on how you feel like they would resonate with the kind of Singaporean kind of decision makers.
So the way that I would go with it, right, is think about branding. So if you work with the Australian government, have approval from the Australian government or some official entities at the, you know, that's like the highest level, right? Then the next level is like, have you done stuff with like universities or places of higher education, places of repute, right? Melbourne Uni, UNSW, any of these sort of organizations. Then it's like, what about global companies have you worked with? So the Coca-Colas of the world or whatever that. And then you're talking about your larger Aussie companies maybe after that, and then it's kind of like everybody else. So you want to just showcase in terms of like, hey, I've worked with serious people, and in Singapore, if you can say that you've worked with the government elsewhere, that's the most serious, and then it will be like, you know, research and kind of institutions or something like that. You just need to kind of prove that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, great. Yeah, thank you very much.
Anybody else have any questions? Oh,
Del, you might want to tell them about the Singapore attitude of FOMO, what they call kiasu.
Yeah, that's the original FOMO, I feel. Yeah.
So
go on, Sherman.
So it's one of those things, Neil, if you have worked with somebody important, for example, all the other companies or all the other entities will go, hey, it's proven, we better go into it. It's almost like any startup. If you get one big investor, normally the smaller ones will follow. So it's going to be not the easiest ride for you to do that, but it's like what Zell said. If you can give yourself the correct branding, they will look into it very, very hard, and they'll look at it from a favorable point of view. I'll give you another. Sorry, I'm doing it slightly different from Zell, because I look at it from a nuanced point of view. Another crazy thing about Singapore, as a stat point of view, that you won't find it on things like the CIA fact book and things like that, is about how they look at appearance in certain ways. It's one of the countries in the world per capita that has the highest amount of what we call supercars ownership. Things like the Lamborghinis, Ferraris, Huayras, and so forth. But it's interesting. It's also the most expensive place in the world to own a car. And if you look at it from a luxury standpoint, this is where pricing comes into play, which is really interesting. From a luxury standpoint, per capita is the largest luxury watch market in the world, meaning that watches are at least 5,000 and above. But the crazy thing is, even if you don't take it per capita, it's still the third largest market for watches of that price bracket and above. So don't be surprised whereby they are actually buying a certain kind of what I call image, inverted commas. So that's where branding is important, how you actually look at it. The other interesting thing is that we have not touched on yet is about the 3 generations of wealth now in Asia or in Singapore. So there will be some, it's a difficult one for me to try and explain, but actually it happens even in Australia, nepotistic appointments or nepotistic investment, meaning that if I built my wealth now and I'm on 3rd generation and I used to be a construction business that is doing very well, but my 3rd generation, meaning my grandkids or my 2nd generation, my children, he or she may not be interested in my business because it's uncool. They would rather be investing in something digital, as an example. But because I've got so much wealth, I can actually afford to let them have some play money and let them learn a business, buy into a business that even if they lose money, it's okay because they have learned that and I can afford to lose that money. So be aware of those kind of things. So at your pitch, sometimes you will see very young people coming into your pitch because they think it's funky to get into the green economy. Just be aware of that. Not all of them are connected, but try to ask that next 2 questions to see what their background is if you can. Do it tactfully, because you'll be surprised. Some of them are basically, I call it princesses or princelings, looking to do something that dad or mom hasn't done before, and they've got the wealth to do that.
I think the other thing that is probably worth mentioning is that Singaporeans are not risk takers by nature. They are, in fact, they are the opposite. And kiasu, which is the phrase that we just used, that phrase means scared to lose. And they basically, like, they are not inherent risk takers. They need to be very sure before they want to do something. And it's like that phrase, nobody's got fired for hiring IBM, right? Which is why they like to go with the big, stable companies more than anything else. And then I've got in here, look, Singapore really is unlike the rest of Asia. Firstly, English is the dominant language in terms of business. And in every meeting that you go to, everybody is comfortable in English. Setting up your bank accounts here, it can be done very quickly. Everything, like, the regulations are actually abided by. There is no bribery as such, like at that kind of level. The corruption is non-existent, where you don't have to kind of look after that guy with a brown paper bag under the envelope, which you may have to do in other parts of Asia. So it is really like, it's a good training bed. It's a good middle space between like a Western kind of style economy versus the Asian one. Okay.
Can I ask a quick question about the cost effectiveness? And apologize, I can't turn my camera on. I'm on my sick bed today, so no one needs to see that. So My question is about the product we have. Is we drive a lot of our USP around the user experience, and it's much smoother, nicer to use. It's a better experience end to end. Therefore, it sits in about in a sort of a premium range price wise compared to maybe direct competitors or adjacent competitors. How do you play that in a market like Singapore, where you were talking about cost effectiveness and discounts being the primary drive? We're not here to save anybody money. Our product will be a net cost to them, but it will give them a benefit in terms of user experience and the way it helps their aggregated product, if that makes sense.
So the other thing that is very useful to understand, I'm sure that you're all familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So that in Asia is wrong. It's not wrong, it's just missing a step. So there is a level, probably midway to the upper half of the pyramid, of status, right? How does what you are providing make their product more premium, more higher value? Is something that you want to sell, that you're better than the competitors, or you let them to be better than the competitors because their interface is better, or because they're able to get better data, or whatever it is that you're specifically able to answer. But I think try to understand at least that part of it. If that makes sense, right? Like if you can't, if you're not going to be a cost, if you're going to be a cost center to them, then emphasize how prestigious or how their status will increase as a result of using this tool.
Yep, that makes sense. Thank you.
Yeah, you'll see what Zell said is true. It's like the example I gave about people driving all these Uber cars in Singapore when the public transport is so good, and yet they want all these things. It is about the status symbol sometimes. So if you can pitch your product to add to them, to give them the added value of the prestige, then it's definitely worth for them to look into your product.
Zal, it's Andrew here. I'm having trouble trying to reconcile the guys driving around in Lambos with flash watches squabbling over 40-cent chicken rice.
Well, Andrew,
it's an interesting dichotomy.
It is the funniest thing that you will see here, because it's about, a lot of it is about perception and value, right? $100,000 watch and $1 million car denotes to the world that I am successful, I am somebody, I have done something. But if I, in my head, have the fact that chicken rice is only like $4, and then I go somewhere and the price is $7, I will think that is ridiculously overpriced and I will not pay for it. And also because I'm most likely eating this on my own or with my friends or my family, and I'm not showcasing this. If I was showcasing it, I would go to one of the super fancy restaurants that are in Singapore so that everybody can see that I'm doing this. But if I'm eating chicken rice at my local or whatever, that is something that it is not, I'm not being viewed by the outside world, so it doesn't really matter. If that makes sense. Look, I mean, I'll put it like this. I'm sure that many of you own a car. And if you think about the value of the car that you own versus the value of the house that you own, usually the car that you own is a significantly smaller percentage of the house that you own. In Singapore, if you drive around the government housing here, which is exceptionally good, 80% of the country lives in these buildings, you will see Mercedes-Benz, BMWs, Ferraris that cost the same or more than that person's entire house. Because nobody is going to see the house, they're going to see the car, and they're going to feel that if you drive this car, you must be wealthy, right? So it is really that once you start understanding the dynamic of what is seen and what is unseen, that's when you start understanding why people will argue about 60 cents as opposed to, if I'm in a fancy restaurant, I have no problem dropping $6,000 on a bottle of wine because I'm in the right space, I'm entertaining the right clients, I'm being seen. But if I'm not, and I'm on my own and I'm just getting lunch, why should I pay $3 more? Like it's really a question of value and perception of value.
Thanks.
The other thing that you'll see in Singapore too, it's what we call people that are self-made and those that are not. So the other thing that we forget about countries like Singapore is that there's a lot of expatriates in Singapore. Very, very high paid professionals from multinationals that are basically setting up regional headquarters there. So some of them will have paid, say, for example, their paychecks would be in the tens of millions as their annual pay. So you'll see some of those that will be eating in the very expensive restaurants, flashy restaurants and so forth, because it's like one of my business partner has always said to me, you know who, when you go into the plane that sits in the pointy end that is self-made and who is actually on a corporate business class or a corporate first class ticket, because the behavior is quite different. So this is where Zell is talking about that chicken rice thing. You have to be able to actually spot that. Because there are people that are self-made that actually thinks about every single cent. And then those that have actually got it easy. So just bear that in mind. You'll see that in Singapore, and you'll see how some of the self-made dress, for example, versus those that are not self-made, the second generation wealth. So be aware of that first and second generation wealth. That's where that whole dichotomy and that thinking comes into play. Because the first generation had it very hard. Remember, Singapore was a bankrupt country when it started 50 odd years ago. So we in Australia sometimes don't see that. We've been very lucky. We have been a developed country for many, many years now. But remember, Singapore has only become this super wealth business, let's call it that way, as a nation, in a very short period of time. And that's why the history, you'll still see what they call first generation, second generation. And in fact, they talk about that even in the government. So in the parliament, they have what they call first generation parliamentarians, second generation leaders, and then third generation leaders that they are trying to build.
So one thing as well, like in terms of like it being a bit different, I'm sure that when you guys entertain your clients in Australia, or if you want to get to know somebody, the best thing is to take them out for drinks. That's not the culture here, right? But if you tell the person that you'll take them out for lunch, it becomes very hard for them to say no, right? And if you particularly are like, hey, do you want to go for a Japanese lunch? Singaporeans love Japanese food, they perceive it to be high value, they perceive it to be expensive, and they know that they're getting a free lunch. They're like 10 times more likely to say yes than they are to any drink.
Can I quickly add to that? One thing that you'll have to learn very quickly. In Australia, we are so normal. It's so normal for us to have salads and a sandwich for a working lunch. Make sure in Singapore you do not do that. It has to be a hot lunch. If you want a working lunch, you'll get a lot more response. And during lunchtime, they like to eat. They do not like to do a working lunch in general because they work long hours. So they want that short break in that sense. And really do not give them sandwiches. I had to negotiate something for one of the carriers, Australian carriers, when they first went to Singapore. It was hilarious because they were saying that they can't get cut through to their staff and clients. And the first thing I asked them, what were you serving for lunch? And they were serving sandwiches because they're Australians. They switched that to things like mee goreng and laksas and so forth. Straight away, they got the cut through within 2 weeks, rather than them being there already for 8 months and they could not get cut through because they were just having sandwiches for working lunch. Zell, I'm not sure whether you agree with me on that.
Yeah, I mean, totally. It's 100, especially if you're going to take somebody out. Like, yeah, the Asians like a hot lunch. What else do I have? Partnerships. I think we've talked about this. I know that we're running out of time. So I just wanted to get to, this is something that is probably going to be very helpful for you. So government support. And the thing that I want to talk about is not necessarily the support and the incentives that they provide for you, which is great, but being an Australian company, not being registered in Singapore, blah, 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 you're probably not going to get covered for a lot of it until you come here. But what is really important is understanding what your customers can take advantage of. What are the tax breaks? What are the grants? I mean, there's a thing in Singapore called the PIC, but I can't even remember what it stands for. A productivity incentive. So it's like if you, and this is across the board, the Singapore government will pay for if you are providing the right technology. So for example, in restaurants, I believe they supported the install of any digital menu systems, right? They would pay for 75% of the price. So the other thing you have to understand about the Singapore government, their belief is that they don't ever pay 100% for anything, because if you don't pay a bit of it, you won't appreciate the value of it. Again, this is going back to that money-mindedness, right? If they give it to you for free, you're not going to value it, so they want to make you pay a little bit. So they will pay 75%, they will pay 80% of the price of your product or your software if you fall within the right group. So take a little bit of time. And again, this helps when you're pitching to a customer, if at the end of your pitch, you can be like, oh, by the way, these are the schemes that you can take advantage of with our product. And this is the reward that you get. So even if you might not be cheaper, if you find the right incentives, if you find the right tax breaks and all of that, it may become a much more compelling case, and it has nothing to do with you. And it's just what the Singapore government is willing to spend. So that is definitely something that, before you're going to pitch to companies here, you should really understand and know that how you're going to take advantage and how you're going to make it cheaper for them. Tangible benefit, and yeah, this is also another thing that you may have to understand about educating and creating more awareness. As I said, Singapore is not as advanced in their thinking when it comes to the sustainability in the environment. People are still being educated here. People are still in their learning process. They're only at the very early beginning stages. So it may take a lot more hand-holding and a lot more talking to them for them to understand the value that you can provide. And I'll talk about capital raising as quickly as I can. I'll stop. Well, we've got 5 minutes. So does anybody have any questions or anything before we I try to speed through this?
This is
No?
being recorded, and I'm sure Zal will provide the slides and tips for you as well.
Sure. And feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn as well. Zal Dastoor. I think I'm the only one on LinkedIn, so it's pretty easy to find. Let's see. Yeah, okay. So develop a compelling investing thesis. And I think this goes back to, the dollars and cents really having to make sense and trying to understand that, like, nobody here, Singapore is, while there's a lot of money in this market, it's not like the US where people are writing like $10 million seed checks. People are conservative with money here. And you can raise, but if you look at where the raises come from, they come from like big funds. And the market is small in the sense that there's like maybe 30 legitimate VCs, right? So if you leverage the government funding, Productivity Solution Grant, that's what I was talking about, PSG. And EDB, again, very helpful in terms of connecting you with the right businesses. But there's a lot of money on offer from the government. Take a look at that. There's a lot of new climate funds that are opening up, and they are looking for options, right? If you're specifically a climate fund and you can only specifically invest, but do the research, because one fund that I talked to, they're only focused on alternative protein as a funding. Some people might only do built environment. So if you understand which fund is focused and targeted, you'll be able to be more appealing to them. And the other thing that I want to talk about is patience in building these relationships. So I'm sure that all of you guys have heard it takes 6 to 12 months to get funding. But I think what I need to clarify here is 6 to 12 months of funding does not mean that you are having first meetings for 6 months or first meetings for 12 months. And then eventually one meeting, somebody's going to say yes. That's not really what they mean. What they mean is that you meet someone in month 1. They'll give you some feedback. You can either take that feedback on board or not. If you do take that feedback on board, you then go back to that same investor, say, hey, over the last 2 months, we learned, you told us to try this and try this. We did that. This is what we learned. And oh, by the way, we've put you on our monthly update newsletter, right? And and then you go back and then he might give you some feedback, and then you spend another 2-3 months implementing it, and then you come back and say, hey, this is what you told us, and this is what we've implemented, and we've been keeping you updated, right? That's what they mean by it takes 6 to 12 months. It's not first meeting, and oh, I'm going to close you in the room. I need you right now. That's not how any of this works, right? You need to show them that you're willing to listen to them. Again, this is all if you want funding and you want it typically from a fund versus a private investor. But you have to show them you're willing to listen. You have to show them you're willing to give them regular updates, keep them informed, even when they don't want it. I mean, worst case, they don't read your email. Best case, they say it, hey, look, these guys are growing. They're doing something. It's impressive. So I think, yeah, scalability and market potential, track record. Again, this is all about reputation, being able to prove that you have it. And honestly, when it comes to funding, when it comes to solving any problem in startups, traction solves all problems. If you have customers, you will get funding. If you have customers, you will grow. It really solves every major problem that you face. So I think that's something that you need to remember and what you need to showcase. And then again, it's about network building. It's about relationship building. It's about building that connection with these people. They want to be able to look you in the eye. They want to know who they're doing business with. That is what Asia is about. It's really very heavy relationship focused. I think that's it. Yeah. So we've got a couple minutes if anybody has any last minute, or Sherman, if you'd like to say anything in terms of that.
Yeah, I just want to add one simple point about fundraising in Singapore. Don't just look at it from a VC's point of view. Think about some of the private wealth offices, family offices, and some of the private banks. Because, like I said, this is where sometimes the rest of Asia use Singapore in some ways as a playground. I'll give you a very simple analogy. Singapore opened 2 casinos, well, now about 15 years ago now. But the incredible thing is, if you look at the background of it, 2 casinos, Vegas had 22 during that time. Within 6 months, the 2 casinos has more revenue than the 22 in Vegas combined. So think about where the wealth comes from. So think about Singapore as Switzerland in Europe in that sense. That's why sometimes if you can get to know some of the family offices or the private wealth, instead of the typical, in Australia, we're so trained to look at that same few VCs in that sense. But in Singapore, there are a lot of private family wealth in there from all different walks, all different parts of Asia going there.
The other thing that I would do is don't make the mistake that I made when I first started a company and was going to Sequoia Capital pitching for 100K, right? Know what stage your investors are involved in, know what types of check size they write, make sure that that like these guys are pre-series A, these guys are series A, these guys, and it makes sense when you're targeting to say that, hey, we know that these are the kind of amounts that you write. This is what we're looking for, blah, 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 because that way it looks like you've done research on them and you understand what they want. Ultimately, the other thing that's a really valuable piece of advice, and probably the last thing I'll leave with you, everybody that you're talking to at a VC, they're employees. Think about it like that. They have a boss, right? Their boss is the general partner, and they have to show their boss why they think that the fund has gone up and they've made money. If you don't think of these guys as like managing their own money, because they're not, they're an employee. So you have to showcase them why investing in you is going to make them look good in front of their boss, who is the LP. And yeah, I mean, I think we're out of time. So I will leave it at that.
Please do connect up with Zal and Sherman and all the mentors that we have listed there so that you can pick their brains. Thank you for your insight. Zal, if you can stop sharing, that would be fantastic.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Sorry.
No, that's okay. But please do pick their brains. And I guess from my observations from this workshop is that you need to put in the groundwork, and it's really important to be connected for those trust circles, to have those really good introductions, because it's more important than, say, the US, where you can just go in, as you reference, Al, guns are blazing and say, hey, I've got this great product. You really do need to rely on those connections. So thank you so much. If you do have any questions, please, you can funnel them through me or reach out direct. I do not mind. But thank you so much for your time today. I'll share this recording out and talk to you soon.
Bye. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks so much, guys. Really interesting.